Hey everyone, welcome to this video. So many of you requested for me to do a true crime story, so we thought why not do a series on the stories that I find the most interesting. Today's story is going to be on Margie Velma Bullard, who liked to go by Velma. Velma was born on October 29th, 1932, and she was the second child of 9 siblings. Her parents were Lillian and Murphy Bullard. They lived on a small tobacco farm in South Carolina, and her mom was a housemaker and her dad was a farmer. Now, this was a time during the Great Depression, and as the Great Depression got worse, her dad was having a really hard time selling his crops. Luckily, he was able to find a job at a textile factory in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Though he got this job, they still grew up with very little. At school, Velma would get picked on for her secondhand clothing and for the type of food that she would bring in. On top of that, she was also having a really hard time at home. Her dad was an alcoholic and would physically abuse her. Her mom never intervened, and this caused a really broken relationship between her and her mom. Velma once said, "Mamas should love their children and stand up for them, and Mama never stood up for me or any of us." While in high school, Velma met Thomas Burke. They began dating when Velma was 16 and Thomas was 17. The moment Velma turned 17, Thomas proposed and she said yes. Many believe this was Velma's way of getting out of her house and far away from her family. Once they got married, Velma and Thomas dropped out of high school and moved to Parkton, North Carolina, where Thomas worked various jobs. He worked at a cotton mill, as a farm laborer, and even as a delivery driver. And Velma worked at a drugstore. Now, they had 2 kids. They had a son, Ronald Thomas, who was born on December 15th, 1951, and a daughter named Kim, who was born on September 3rd, 1953. After having children, Velma became a stay-at-home mom and loved being with her kids. She volunteered at school and took the kids for field trips where kids would love to drive with her because they considered her the fun mom. As the kids got older, Velma was able to find a job at a textile factory just like her dad did years before. This really allowed them to move into a nice home where they lived happily for 15 years. In 1963, Velma began to have medical issues and had to get a hysterectomy. This left her with a lot of lower back pain. It also caused her to be depressed, nervous, and she was more on edge than usual. After this, Thomas joined the JCs, which is a community of people who try to create positive change. While Thomas was out at these meetings, Velma was left home alone, and she was not happy about this, especially because Thomas was out drinking with his friends. By this time, Thomas had become a heavy drinker, which Velma believed was the devil's juice. 2 years later, in 1965, Thomas was driving home from a meeting when his car jumped off the highway, sailed into the air, and luckily landed on its wheels in someone's driveway. Thomas suffered a concussion when he banged his head on the steering wheel. This caused him to have a lifetime of severe headaches. Velma was convinced this happened because Thomas was drinking, though he denied he was drinking and just said he was really tired. In 1967, Velma's concern came true. Thomas was arrested for drunk driving and ended up getting fired from his job. As you can imagine, this caused Thomas to drink even more, and his and Velma's arguments only escalated. Their home life had been turned upside down. Their kids no longer wanted to invite their friends over because they didn't want them witnessing their parents arguing, or worse, their dad being drunk. While still dealing with her lower back pain and a stressful home life, Velma's health continued to decline. After seeing her doctor, they prescribed her a mild tranquilizer called Librium. And this was the beginning of Velma overusing pain medication. She would visit multiple doctors to get more and more prescriptions. This would often leave her groggy, and her kids and Thomas began to worry. Then, one day, while the kids were at school and Velma was at the laundromat, she caught word that the house had burnt down. Thomas was the only one home and unfortunately died of smoke inhalation. It was believed that Thomas was smoking and dropped his cigarette when he had passed out from drinking. When they told Velma, she was so distraught she fell to the ground only to be caught by her children. After the fire, Velma and her kids moved into her parents' house. Within only a few months, Velma began dating the much older Jennings Barfield, who was also a widower. Jennings' wife died around the same time Thomas did. This caused them to bond over their loss. Another thing to note is that Jennings had multiple health problems, such as diabetes, heart failure, and emphysema. On August 23, 1970, Velma and Jennings got married. After the wedding, Velma and her kids moved in with Jennings and his teenage daughter at their home in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Early in their marriage, troubles began. They fought over Velma's use of medication. She had already overdosed twice and was rushed to the hospital. She had promised Jennings that she would no longer use, but soon after, she was back in the hospital with another overdose. This caused Velma and Jennings to separate, but eventually they got back together. They often said their marriage was a mistake. They planned to divorce, but each was waiting for the other to leave. Then, on March 21st, 1971, Jennings Barfield died of a heart attack. Velma did not cope well with Jennings' death. She doubled up on more medication and spent days in bed. On top of that, her son was sent to Fort Jackson in South Carolina. This caused Velma to fall worse into her depression. She was arriving late to work, which then caused her to get fired from her job. Because of this, her and her daughter had to move back into her parents' house. While living there, at only 61 years old, Velma's dad died of lung cancer. As you can imagine, this left Velma in an even darker place. She was then left to care for her mother, who she continued to have a tense relationship with. Following this, things continued to go bad for Velma. In 1972, she got arrested for forging a prescription, but luckily, she got off with just a suspended sentence and a fine. As time passed, Velma was still having a hard time dealing with her mom, Lily. Lily wanted Velma to wait on her hand and foot, and Velma did not want to be ordered around. In the summer of 1974, Lily began to feel ill. She had horrible stomach cramps. She had a violent case of diarrhea and vomiting. Eventually, Velma took her to the hospital, and thankfully, she was feeling better within just a couple of days. As the family gathered for the holiday season, Lily had spoken to her son about a suspicious letter she had gotten in the mail. The letter stated that she was behind on a loan and her car could get repossessed if she did not make a payment. She explained to her son that she didn't have a loan, so her son brushed it off, saying that it must have been a mistake. A couple days later, Lily began to feel sick again. She was feeling nauseous, vomiting, and said that her insides felt like they were burning up. It wasn't until she started vomiting blood that they called the ambulance and she was rushed to the hospital. Sadly, it was only 2 hours later that Lily passed away. The following year, in 1975, Velma was sentenced to 6 months in jail for writing bad checks. However, due to good behavior, she only served 3 months. As soon as she got out, Velma started looking for work, and she accepted a job as a caretaker. Now, Montgomery was 94 years old, bedridden, needed to be fed, and had major health issues. Due to diabetes, he had lost his vision and both of his legs. As time went on, problems began to arise. Dolly, an 84-year-old cancer survivor, thought that Velma was getting lazy and not doing a good job, and would often verbalize it to Velma. So of course, Velma complained that Dolly was nitpicking at everything she would do. The tension only increased. In January of 1977, Montgomery Edwards died. Velma stayed at the Edwards residence to care for Dolly. Then, only a month later, Dolly began to feel sick. She told her stepson that she felt like she was getting the flu due to vomiting and diarrhea. A few days later, her stepson came back to visit her and was shocked to see how weak and pale she looked. so he demanded that they take her to the hospital. Velma got on the phone and called the ambulance. Luckily, Dolly was treated by doctors and was sent back home. The next day, Dolly was worse than before and was back in the hospital. Sadly, she died later on that evening. And now, with the Edwards passing, Velma was on the hunt for a new job. It wasn't long before Velma began working for another elderly couple, 80-year-old farmer John Henry Lee and his 76-year-old wife, Record. Now, Record had recently broken her leg and she could barely get around. This new position allowed Velma to live with the Lees on the outskirts of Lumberton, where she also attended church services with them. Soon after Velma started working with the Lees, Record found a check that made her very worried because she was certain that she did not sign it. So her husband, John Henry, called the cops, but the case was thrown out because no one could figure out who would have forged Record's name. On April 27, 1977, mysteriously, John Henry got sick. His stomach was upset and he developed diarrhea. When his condition got worse, Velma called the paramedics and they rushed him to the hospital. John Henry slowly recovered, and after 4 days he was released. Doctors said it was probably just a virus. As his weight continued to drop, he would go days feeling well, and then all of a sudden he would have vomiting, cramps, and cold sweats. His family was so grateful for Velma for being there to attend his every need. They felt lucky that she was there. On June 4th, John Henry took a turn for the worse. Velma called the ambulance, but unfortunately, there was very little that the hospital could do. Sadly, John Henry passed away with what doctors called a severe stomach virus. Later on that year, in October, Velma began dating Stuart Taylor. Stuart had a series of failed relationships and was still looking for someone to spend the rest of his life with. Velma finally felt like she found someone that could take care of her and give her resources to continue feeding her secret drug addiction. To secure the relationship, Velma ties herself up and stages a break-in. Stuart then invites Velma to live with him. A month later, Velma began forging checks in Stuart Taylor's name. It doesn't take long before Stuart catches her. He confronts her and tells her to stop, but doesn't end the relationship. The next year, in February of 1978, Stuart becomes sick during church services. He has extreme stomach pain and nausea. It's so bad that his friend calls the ambulance as soon as they get home. They rush him to the hospital, and unfortunately, Stuart dies just hours after arriving. This is very odd because unlike the other people in Velma's life that passed away, Stuart was only 56 years old. So dying of gastronitis was very alarming. Because of this, doctors asked Stuart's family if they want them to perform an autopsy to find the root cause of his death. His family agrees, and Velma encourages this decision. While waiting for the results and funeral arrangements are being made, Velma gets treated like family. She's there for every decision, and she even gets invited to ride with the family for Stuart's services. In March of 1978, the autopsy results come in, and they show that Stuart had arsenic in his system. This is the first time Velma is caught. The date is March 10th, 1978, and Velma gets brought in for questioning as she's being charged with first-degree murder. While she's being held, Velma's sister calls the police and lets them know that she believes that Velma also poisoned her mother and the other patients she used to take care of. After hearing this, police had the bodies of Lillian Ballard, the Edwards, and John Henry Lee tested, where they all tested positive for arsenic and rat poison. After confessing to those 4 murders, Velma insisted that she had nothing to do with her second husband's death. But in May of 1978, his body was also tested and came back positive for arsenic and rat poison, just like her other victims. In November of 1978, the trial begins and Velma is facing first-degree murder. The prosecutor on this case, Joe Freeman Britt, was known as the deadliest DA because of how many people he sent to the death chamber. While on trial, Velma called these deaths unfortunate accidents. She stated that she didn't mean to kill them. She just wanted to make them weak and sick so they wouldn't realize that she was stealing from them. On December 2nd, 1978, Velma was officially found guilty for the death of Stuart Taylor. It only took the jury hours to give her the death sentence. This was the first death sentence given to a female in the United States in over 40 years. While serving at the North Carolina Correctional Facility for Women, Velma got the nickname Death Row Granny. There, she would be forced to get clean from all prescription medication, and she reconnected with her Christian faith. Because of this, Velma ended up appealing her death sentence, claiming that she had been forgiven of all of her sins and she was a changed woman. Her appeals were infamous in the media, especially because she appeared to be a sweet grandmother. Her execution days had been moved several times. This made people believe that it was going to be called off entirely, but that was not the case. In 1984, Velma was moved to an institute in Raleigh, North Carolina to prepare for her execution date, which would be November 2nd. Velma was given the option of death by lethal injection or cyanide gas. She chose lethal injection. For her last meal, Velma requested cheese doodles and Coca-Cola. She also requested to be executed in her favorite pink pajamas, which she was. At 2 a.m. on November 2nd, 1984, Margie Velma Barfield, at 52 years old, became the first woman in U.S. history to be executed by lethal injection. Her official time of death was 2:15. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this true crime story. I've been thinking about doing these once a week, so let me know in the comments if you think I should, and also let me know what your favorite true crime story is. We'll see you guys next time. Bye!